right, and now we are going to touch briefly on the ancient church modes, which were an attempt by people of the Middle Ages to recreate the Greek modes. The Greeks didn't use their CD players to record any modes, so it was just a very good guess as to what these were. And you can still find some hymns in our hymnal that utilize modes. They are not necessarily interchangeable with the idea of scales. Here it says the modes transcend mere scale formations and are regulated by idiomatic and melodic expressions. So they had to do with the way the melody worked. From 800 to 1500, music was composed using these modes. And in the simplest terms, over time, a couple modes became more and more popular and developed into what is now our major and minor scales. So you have something called the final, which is the beginning tone. And you've got authentic scales and plagal scales, which we may or may not really get into right now. The prefix hypo indicates that the plagal modes begin a fourth lower than the authentic forms. For my purposes, we're mostly sticking with the authentic forms. If you study music of the Middle Ages, you'll have a chance to become more well-versed than I am in these things. So the Dorian mode is the equivalent of going from D to D with no sharps or flats, and the half steps occur between the second and third scale degrees and the sixth and seventh scale degrees. If you want to compare it to a natural minor scale, it's like a natural minor scale with a raised sixth degree. And that is helpful to know if you need to transpose your mode to start on a different note. And I went over this with my magnetic boards. Phrygian mode is from E to E with no sharps or flats, and the half steps are between 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. So an equivalent to a natural minor scale would be a natural minor scale with a lowered second degree. And again, you would use this information to transpose it to another key. The Lydian mode is from F to F. It's like a major scale with a raised fourth degree. The half steps are between 4 and 5, B and C, and E and F. Mixolydian mode could be equated to a G major scale with a lowered seventh degree, and the half steps are between 3 and 4 and 6 and 7. And then the plagal names. If the scale is starting a fourth below the final, then it's Hypodorian. Hypophrygian, Hypolydian, and Hypomixolydian. Early in the Renaissance period, 1450 to 1600, they got some other modes. The Aeolian mode, which evolved into, so the Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian were the earliest modes. And then somebody concocted the Aeolian mode and the Ionian mode. So then they had the Hypoaeolian, the Hypoionian, and the Aeolian mode evolved into the natural minor scale, and the Ionian mode evolved into the major scale. Now turning the page 46. The modes are, well, the solfege that we use came out of the same time as these modes, and they were taken from a hymn to St. John, which I'm not going to try to say the Latin, but I'll play it for you. This is figure 2.37. And somebody got the idea to take the names for the solfege from the words ut and then re, mi, fa, sol, la. Okay, so that's where it came from, or where they can trace it. Tonal scales. The tonal system of major and minor scales developed during the early part of the Baroque period, which came right after the Renaissance, well, more or less, with a few intervening transpositional periods. This coincided with the emergence of key consciousness in music. By the end of the Baroque period, the church modes had generally ceased to have any influence, and people were going with major and minor. And there's a whole lot more to it than this. They're the basis of music. Major and minor keys are the basis of music for the classical period. And there was a little bit of chromaticism to be decorative, but by the Romantic period, the chromaticism increased to the point that major and minor keys began to be a little more difficult to discern. And the idea of tonality began to break down. Expanded scale use. With the breakdown of the major minor key signature, this is like skiing atop, this is like rocket launch through music history. With the breakdown of the major minor key system, Impressionist composers began to experiment with other scales. They were fond of the pentatonic, the modal scales, and whole tone scales. And 20th century composers and 21st century composers were searching around for other types of scales to use in their music. They liked the chromatic scale. They experimented with non-traditional scales and microtonal scales. Popular music of the 20th and 21st century is the last stronghold of major and minor keys. Until the 1960s, the great majority of pop songs were written in major keys, but some songs in minor keys or blues scales are out there. So figuring out what key you're in is a good first step for figuring out something more about the piece. So a pitch inventory is simply figuring out what notes are being used and then arranging them in a way that tells you what key is happening. So in figure 2.38, jumping quickly from medieval modes to Dvorak, here's figure 2.38. So if you take a pitch inventory, you've got a D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, which they've decided to put as, I don't know why they put it this way, because there's not a high G in the piece, but it's the G major scale. If you flip those notes around until they make a scale, they make a G major scale. Okay, so on your own, read the summary. When you have questions, email me or bring them to class, because if you have a question, someone else is going to have the same question. And the next video, we'll start working on the homework.